Many people claim to be experts, but they never actually do the research. They won't even touch those tablets.
Right.
And so myself and Matt are probably one of the very few people that actually really have dug deep. And I knew that he can help me bring forward this story. And I knew that our collaborations that we had done previously on just like YouTube and podcasts were so great, people really loved us, that if we got together and did a book, we can really put this story out in a way that people could understand it and digest it.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, so now let's dig into the story, because we're talking about essentially creating a timeline that changes our understanding of who we are, what humanity is, as you say, Homo sapiens sapien, right? So where do we begin? Let's start.
Well, I guess the place to start is that we have to understand where it started and when it started.
Yes.
You know, that's really what comes into. Is our story of human civilizations emerging out of the Fertile Crescent only 6,000 years old? Or is there a completely set of chapters that go before that?
Yeah.
And that's what the goal of this book is, not only to tell the story and provide the evidence, but have as many ancient texts and pieces of ancient texts that have the most important information all in one place. Mm-hmm. And that's really was the goal of this, is to be this almost like I guess you could call it this epic chronology of ancient knowledge and evidence, and putting it all together in something that people can tangibly look at and say, oh, that makes sense, or it maybe doesn't make sense.
Well, and one of the intriguing parts is that it's connecting cultures around the world that were thought to be disparate and not connected in any way prior, right? That's a big part of this.
Yeah.
So that brings up a whole slew of other questions, like how'd that happen? You know, how in supposedly primitive times did they develop the same kind of symbolism or parts of language or artwork when they're literally halfway around the globe from each other? And that gets into some very interesting territory. So we'll go there in a little bit, but let's start with the Sumerian story.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
Adama.
So the Sumerian story, and then of course Billy has a lot of knowledge in this area as well. The Sumerian story is interesting because there's different chapters that seem to go back far, far earlier than we've ever been taught in school or has been acknowledged by mainstream archaeologists, to the point where we're talking about something more than 12, more than 50, maybe more than 100,000 years ago. And even if certain tablets can't survive that long, the story has been carried down and then rescribed in those tablets over and over and over again by subsequent cultures such as the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans. We're talking about a region that has had more habitation by civilizations, in my opinion, than anywhere else in the world. And so because of that, and because of their sophistication and influences, it enables us to have a glimpse into looking at our story in a way that's tangible and evidence-driven, unlike really most other places that we have around the world.
Interesting, and this is bringing up a lot of different things you say as what's left in tablets, papyrus and so forth. What's left with pyramids? I mean, even Robert Schoch, when he first saw the Great Pyramid, said he thought it was closer to 100,000 years old. You can't talk about it publicly, you lose tenure. So we get that, but I mean, that was a fairly shocking statement for him, and we know others that were contemporaneous with his early work who were saying the same things. Now you're saying there's yet even more evidence.
Exactly.
And let's start with the notion, since we're talking about the human species, that there was a notion of an original perfected man, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a specific tablet called the Myth of Adapa that goes into that and actually specifically calls that out. And Billy and I have talked about that in shows previous, where the language in it actually says that this was a perfected being that was considered a sage of the first city of Eridu, which was interesting because there's another tablet called the Uruk List of Kings and Sages that lists him as the first sage of that. So you get this cross-examination of tablets and information that correlate. And what it says in the Myth of Adapa is that Adapa was the first perfect man created. And it says that he was the most perfect among the Anunnaki, as in we are them and they are us, and that there was something created in their image that was done so to be perfect. And I think we should remember that, rather than this more primitive viewpoint that we're given with aspects of Darwinism and other things.
I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Billy, what do you have to say on this?
Well, when you look at the Myth of Adapa, you realize that human beings have such a high capacity for learning spiritually and technologically, and that there were people here, many more people, maybe even millions of people, long before the Adapa, but Adapa was the first of the more advanced created. In other words, the best version of what they could do for a Homo sapien sapien. And that's where we came out of. And so basically, it's not that we came out of only Adam and Eve, two people, because if you inbreed like that, we already know what's going to happen.
Yeah, you outbreed pretty fast.
Right, exactly, really fast. So some people tend to think that you still can get 8 billion people from two, but it's not. The thing is, they duplicated what they did with Adapa, but Adapa was one of the very first sages, and he had the wisdom, and he was known to potentially even be greater than the Anunnaki themselves.
That's fascinating. And I have to say, because I have shared with you my own understanding of the origin that has to do with the original person, people, and it overlays with what you're saying. And I particularly like it when there are points of connection between stories, so to speak. And the one part of that story that is kind of an exact hit is that one type of human, of being, was chosen for this particular expression as human being, and that it existed already. We're not an extension of Neanderthals or any other species. We are our own unique, perfected species to the degree that we're perfect, and we were like us. We look very similar. However many hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, we were this already. And this seems to overlay with that to an extent, even if we don't know timelines exactly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it seems that that perfected being in that location at that time gives us a way to look at it and say, well, what was going on during that time period, but when was that time period? And that's really what the focus is.
And that's always the hard part.
Yeah, well, that was the challenge here, is like, can we actually date when these events occurred? And turns out we actually can.